All right. So yeah, so there's two of my works that I want to use as or that I draw from, or that my talk is based on. And I think this edited volume caught the attention of the seminar series organizers, and I'm glad that it did. So in introduction to this book, which is an open access book, so it's freely available online for you to read, and there are various interesting chapters on energy transitions in the global south. So we, for the first time, we sketched this urgency versus justice idea in the introduction of this book, and I've built on that to recently publish this article about energy geographies in the Anthropocene. We can also think of that as energy transitions in the Anthropocene, and what is the next thing that we might think about doing. So you can think of it as a more advanced version of that, of introduction to that. So today my talk is drawing from these pieces of work. Okay, so some of you might be familiar with the work of historian and post-colonial scholar Dipesh Chakrabarty. So Dipesh Chakrabarty, in his writings on the Anthropocene, he sort of brings to fore two images of human beings that he argues inhabits the Anthropocene. So we can see humans as in two forms in the Anthropocene. One is humans as a political force, and the other as a geological force. As a political force, or as political beings, we human beings seek justice, supposedly as right-bearing citizens. So we have various kinds of human rights, etc., that we are told within the format of the nation state, but also within global formats like United Nations. So as political beings, we seek justice as supposedly right-bearing citizens, while knowing from historical evidence, that full justice is unachievable for us. Therefore, we continue to engage in survival politics. And this politics we can understand, I would argue, as politics of or for justice, politics of or for justice. And as geological force, what we talked about until now in reference to Anthropocene, as a geological force, humans, that is all humans emerge as collective authors of action that many scholars of the Anthropocene argue that collective authors of action that have resulted in phenomena like climate change. Now we can argue here that have we all been collective authors of action? This question of collectivity is quite important, and I think I would argue that this collectivity is should be a more future-looking idea than an idea of historical responsibility. So all human beings collectively can hold responsibility to tackle climate change. But can we argue that all human beings are equally responsible for climate change? So that's kind of a tension that emerges here also. These two seemingly incompatible images of humans open, for me, a dilemma of justice versus urgency. One forces us to think of difference, our difference, or different people, different identities, different histories. So one of them forces us to think of difference, and the other prompts us to think of a universal human agency. This realization of human agency has brought a certain sense of shared universal urgency that calls for swift preventive action and techno-managerial control, for example, for climate change mitigation and rapid energy transitions. This is a dilemma because urgency, and I don't say that urgency is wrong, so urgency is not fully misplaced, but it risks compromising due course, discussion, and justice. When we talk about urgent movement, there's often a compromise of debate, of democracy also, quite often. So just briefly to touch upon this idea of Anthropocene urgency, we see a lot of calls for urgency and emergency, or idea of climate emergency emerging around the world. So a dominant framing of an abstract universal anthropos is, but within these calls of emergency, and I see quite a bit. So for the British newspaper, The Guardian, has argued in 2019 that it is changing its editorial format. So it's changing its what is the terminology? Yeah, the format of how they write, and they prefer to use now terms like climate emergency, climate crisis, climate breakdown now even, rather than climate change. And rather than global warming, they would like to use global heating and similar kind of movements. And I was looking through Le Monde last evening on the train. There is no such editorial decision by Le Monde, I found. Maybe some of you know this, or you could enlighten me, because I was looking at the English AI-generated English version, so I might have missed some stuff. But I did notice that they frequently, in the more recent articles, they use the word climate emergency, climate crisis, but they don't have any set pattern. But there's a frequency of use of climate. But interestingly, we can also see from United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres using the term climate crisis. So it's kind of, and the use of these ideas, climate emergency and climate crisis, on a universal level, on a global level, have become very prominent. But it is, I find this quite risky, because I would argue that a dominant framing of this abstract idea of universal urgency based on a universal humanity is problematic in many ways, not least because we know that these universal ideas have a long history of racial and colonial logics embedded within them. So we can learn something from history, and I'll come back to that. But also critical scholars like Eric Sungedu remind us that an Anthropocene debate centering the universal has the potential to make climate change post-political. And we can see evidences of that already now in global discourses on climate change. What is this idea of post-political? A post-political condition is one in which power and politics are written out of the mainstream accounts of environmental transformation. Ranganathan and Doshi argue. And one of two explanations are prompted. So power and politics are written out, and two explanations are proposed. One, that we are all in this together equally. And the second, that these things are results of abstract forces like capitalism, which serve as teleological black boxes. So we can't find the beginning or end of capitalism to tackle it and to challenge it. So it's either that it's a universal equal togetherness, or it is a result of capitalism. And these risk the exclusion of an explicit politics of justice, I would argue. So this post-political condition is something that we need to keep in mind as we go forward. And we can see this kind of equally, we are all in this together equally becoming even more prominent within the global regimes of climate governance, especially through United Nations Framework Convention. And the Paris COP was kind of a changing big transition moment in there, where not only developed countries were taking targets for carbon reduction, but developing countries, or all countries, were taking targets for climate reduction. So it's kind of this transition is something useful to keep in mind. Now, it is worth asking, for us, it is worth asking if a sense of global emergency risks heralding a post-political Anthropocene, one that demands falling in line, putting questions of difference, justice, rights, responsibilities aside. So in short, uniting by putting our differences aside, or uniting by putting the question of difference aside. This question is pertinent because while the Anthropocene calls us to unite, its impact are and will be felt very differently around the world. And if we are to politically or even discursively understand, experience, and respond as a geological force, as a united force, as a united humanity, that such responses need to be built by ethically centering subaltern groups who have borne the brunt of historical injustices upon which Anthropocene is premised, and who will bear the gravest impacts of the Anthropocene. So we need to center those subaltern groups which are on the front line of this, or have historically been on the front line of this issue. So what we see now is a climate emergency being overlaid on other socio-cultural and economic crises, so that climate crisis is also itself constitutively shaped by other problems, processes, and hierarchies. And evidence of this is manifesting in new neoliberal projects around smart grids, smart cities, eco-gentrification, geoengineering, and other global setups. For example, India and France came together at Paris COP to announce International Solar Alliance, which hopes to build massive solar power between Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, supported. And then a follow-up of that was in COP26 in Glasgow, the announcement of India and UK coming together to announce a global green grid. This is if there was a techno-utopian idea which sounded absurd, it is an idea like global green grid. Which is also, it comes together with the International Solar Alliance. So the question in front of us, and especially for us critical social scientists, then is how to think of justice rooted in difference while thinking of universal human agency. So how to unite together while also maintaining a sense of justice rooted in difference. How might we think of our work for a more political rather than a post-political Anthropocene? Yeah. So while the normative discourse on the Anthropocene risks depoliticization, it is important for us to remember that to stress that the Anthropocene is a master narrative should not detract us, Tariq Jazil argues, from the suggestion that it is a narrative. Anthropocene is only one of the narratives, or the dominant narrative of the Anthropocene is only one narrative. Indeed, a lot of decolonial, indigenous, and critical race scholars have presented multiple narrative stories for the origin of the Anthropocene. And if I imagine many of you have already are already familiar with these multiple origin stories of the Anthropocene. If you're not, I would be happy to talk about some of this later on. But those arguments are quite important because they provide us an important countercurrent to this dominant universal narrative of the Anthropocene. However, as post-colonial and decolonial scholars have pointed out, an overwhelming urgency politics prioritizes a few interlocutors, as Mabel Gergen has argued. It prioritizes a few interlocutors and their specific registers of space and time. This often means the question of how to manage urgency and justice dilemma, even if we accept that there is a dilemma of urgency versus justice. What happens then is that how to manage this urgency versus justice dilemma itself is not debated on an equal playing field. Political, economic, and scientific institutions emphasize and amplify dominant universalist narratives compared to subaltern narratives of justice. So some of our work might be, I would think, to enhance those subaltern narratives of justice within this global narrative of the Anthropocene. So what is important then is that we use the Anthropocene narrative to confirm the importance of decolonizing political, economic, and scientific institutions, not to deny urgency, but to create space for new narratives on the dilemma to be considered. And there's some interesting and important work going on right now. I mean, during the recent COP27 in Egypt, There was the proposal of loss and damage fund that many of you might be familiar with. But alongside that, there was also a very prominent discussion of reforming global institutions like the IMF. The way that they operate right now is very colonial in nature, and a reform of that was very prominently argued. So that those kind of work, I think, is very interesting to keep track of, and perhaps important also. So, so following Tariq Jazil, we can argue that rather than a recolonization of knowledge, a closure, we could work with the idea of Anthropocene to create an opening for decolonizing our knowledge systems, and to work towards what Juanita Sandberg has argued as multi-epistemic literacy. So to learning from multiple places, multiple people, multiple knowledge systems, to enhance our understanding of how to tackle this problem. It is in this spirit that I look for a more political Anthropocene, one that tackles the urgency of collective action while keeping a politics of justice at its heart. So until now, if you had thought that I was denying the need for urgency, that is not my argument. And so what I will do in the rest of the talk today is that I will outline two areas of work that could further a politics of justice for energy transitions. So the first one is to think about histories, to think about energy histories. And a lot of people are already working on energy histories quite interestingly. So working with Sylvia Winther's arguments, Sylvia Winther is a very important thinker. Her thinking embedded in the spatiality of the Caribbean and the history of the Caribbean also. So working with Sylvia Winther's arguments, Catherine Yusuf has very persuasively shown how racialization and racial injustices are central to the idea of the Anthropocene. Yusuf explains that the historical uses and abuses of energy, whether physical energy, so a lot of physical energy was used initially to carry out industrial work, or fossil energy, are premised on colonization and racial exploitation, whether of enslaved Black and Indigenous Americans or indentured South Asians. And Miles Lennon argues that the first, and very interesting, this is a very interesting argument, that the first industrial scale energy infrastructure was the transatlantic slave trade, the foundational apparatus of demattering of Black lives. So where people were used, or people who were not understood or who were not thought as people, they were thought as resources or energy, sources of energy, were put to work in very dehumanizing conditions, and also traded as assets that could be put to work. And similarly, we can think of American plantations as a machine for conversion of solar energy into surplus value. And these plantations could not have existed without a violent symbolic order to distinguish between human race, that is white people, and savages, that is the native people of Americas, or also black people who were enslaved. And so this is quite interesting because within the framework of energy transitions, we often don't think of these things. We don't think of these histories of energy that are related to bodily energy, or histories of putting energy into industrial work that were extracted from bodily energy through dehumanizing of particular human beings. And that is important for us to remember, because that sort of produced the, as Catherine Yusuf argues, that produced the bouncing board for capitalism to take off, for industrial revolution to take off. A lot of these processes that happened before the industrial revolution, we often, within the framework of our critique, we often forget those processes which created the conditions for industrial revolution to take off. Similarly, Malini Ranganathan, referring to Lisa Lowe, provides a useful reminder that as slavery ended, and there's a lot of European pride in ending of slavery, or definitely in the UK, there's this idea that we ended slavery, and we forget that we also started slavery. But also, what happens when we end slavery? So Malini Ranganathan provides a useful reminder that as slavery ended, the figure of Chinese and Indian coolies emerged in the British Empire, the supposedly free agents that signaled a liberal empire's ostensibly benevolent and enlightened transition. But these indentured laborers, when they signed the agreement of indenturehood, they were basically signing off their lives, right? So within the framework of legality, it was understood as a liberal idea that these people have options and rights, but really within the framework of indenturehood, these did not exist. And Chinese and Black labor physical energy was central to construction and operation of North American railroads, as Deborah Cohen and Malini Ranganathan argue. And so what we can see that the operation of these steam-powered fossil fuel mechanical energy of railways was thereby premised on the exploitation of racialized physical energy. So we come to the Industrial Revolution by extraction of physical energy from racialized and indentured peoples around the world. Why am I talking about this now? First of all, it is important that we don't forget the history, so we don't ignore the difference that currently exists. But also, very importantly, these patterns of extraction of bodily energy and the extraction of patterns of extraction of bodily energy, but also extraction of bodily energy to excavate fossil energy. Most people who worked in mines were also these enslaved people. So not only were their bodily energy being extracted, but they were the key conduits for extraction of fossil fuel also. But these patterns of extraction of bodily energy and the extraction of bodily energy to excavate fossil energy, or to facilitate technologies premised on fossil energy, many scholars are now arguing, continue in the contemporary transitions to renewable energy. So Lennon reminds us that while in the West, we might see that the perceived ability of decentralized renewable energy to dismantle fossil fuel establishments that were premised on racialized discrimination, and that is being celebrated now, this effect of decentralized renewable energy. But a closer investigation of, for example, global solar industry reveals labor, health, and environmental violations in production facilities and assembly lines in the global South. So there's already a lot of evidence of exploitative conditions of labor in solar factories in China and other parts of Southeast Asia. There's also a lot of evidence of now emerging and more research being conducted on extraction of, for example, lithium and cobalt. Cobalt has a very longer history that many of us are familiar with, of fueling conflict in DRC, but also, and not just because of solar industry, but our phones and laptops, etc. Not just conflicts, but also inhumane working conditions, child slavery, etc. So while these decentralized renewable energy are being celebrated in the West as perhaps more emancipatory forms of energy, their global patterns still reveal these historical patterns of inhuman or dehumanization, if we say it in short. Therefore, while renewable energy might help overturn racialized infrastructures in particular parts of the world, such overturning will be premised on the exploitation of people and communities of color in other parts of the world. So following Catherine Yusuf, I would argue that we need to examine the coming together. Catherine Yusuf uses a very nice word, kinship, brotherhood between, or familiarity between extraction of bodies and extraction of earth, in Yusuf's words, in places where genocide and ecocide come together. In a lot of these neo-colonial projects for extraction of minerals like lithium and cobalt that are central to multiple technologies of contemporary and future energy transitions. So we often celebrate techno-utopian projects like electric cars, etc. But a lot of these forms of individual mobility will still lead to massive extraction and exploitation in other parts of the world. And evidence of that is already coming through now. So so that's one part of why we need to think about history, because the history of energy, extraction of energy, exploitation of energy, links together what happened in the past and what we are still ignoring right now and for the future, in the name of urgency. And focusing on the question of history can also take us to alternate understandings of the Anthropocene and the central role of fossil energy, or the central role of energy. And here I've argued that, at least this is what I studied since I started doing social science, that electrification histories of Northern America and Europe have been very influential within energy geographies and energy transitions. So a lot of us within STS, at least, we know about these books about electrification of Europe, electrification of Americas by Thomas Hughes or Bill Nye. But such histories of electrification from parts of global South are very few and only now emerging, which is really good that they're emerging, at least. So as a result, the histories of electrification around the Atlantic, Americas and the Europe, I argue, circulate as global histories, that they become histories of electrification of the world, which is kind of a blindsided, or us being blindsided. And so giving a counterpoint to such global histories, Elizabeth Chatterjee urges us to look at electricity-focused histories in Asia for instructive insight into the Anthropocene. Chatterjee explains that the Asian histories of electrification do not neatly fit the schema that focuses on capitalism and imperialism as explanatory variables for the climate crisis and the Anthropocene. For example, if we talk about India, if we talk about post-colonial India, post-colonial states like India, quite interestingly, with a need to prove its legitimacy and bind a very diverse, because India is such a big country and such a diverse country, that to prove its legitimacy and to bind a diverse territory into one nation state and rapidly catch up with the West, which is also quite it's important to keep in mind. The post-colonial state in India positioned itself as a guarantor of energy provision. So it wasn't private companies, it wasn't imperialist powers, it was the state that positioned itself as a guarantor of energy provisions. And so referring to this double move of state intervention and decommodification as fossil developmentalism, Chatterjee argues that rather than an overwhelming focus on finding a solution to the climate change in anti-capitalism, the new moral economy of fossil developmentalism alerts us that the inclusive promise of fossil consumption goes much deeper, penetrating virtually every aspect of contemporary life and its politics. So fossil fuel and its promise of good life is so embedded that it cannot just be decentered by working on anti-capitalism. So indeed, even in India, the state policies push, now we see that things are changing also in India, and the state policies push electricity into the realm of private resources, but citizens still continue to imagine and claim electricity as a public good, and the state as a guarantor of this good. So Chatterjee warns us that it might be difficult to decouple our life worlds from our deep desire for cheap energy, even however hard we might try. And this developmentalism and desire for modernity have repeatedly manifested as electoral demands, articulated in India as electricity, road, and water, these cornerstones of modern life, having electricity, having clean water, and having roads to connect each other. And so for critical energy scholars, I would say to get to grips with these complex histories of energy and modernity, an interrogation of fossil cultures and energy cultures in emerging economies and post-colonial context is very crucial, not least because these contexts have a very different articulation, but also that many of these emerging economies are some of the biggest producers of greenhouse gases right now and will be in the future also. So understanding them in a better way is quite crucial for us now. And these modernities and energy cultures might open new ways of thinking through the Anthropocene and new pathways out of it. Concurrently, parochializing Western claims of universal energy history, as Kara Daggett argues, is necessary to assign responsibilities for and in the Anthropocene, and to imagine alternative energy pathways that are adequately just and radical. So that's kind of my proposal to you on thinking more carefully through histories. The second thing that I want to talk about is the question of difference. And these are intimately linked, as you will have already guessed until now, that I've talked a lot about history in conjunction with difference, in conjunction with colonization, racialization, and producing of this difference, but also establishing of this difference. So within this question of difference, I argue that the questions of race, in Indian context, at least the question of caste, and globally, question of indigeneity are quite important. And the racialized nature of the industrial scale extraction of energy, historically, I've already explained, from enslaved people, and contemporarily from people of color, whether in global north or south, are important factors for us to focus on. And for example, in South Africa, we know during the apartheid period that although a democracy was in place for namesake, the apartheid engendered a narrow and racialized democracy that excluded Black majority, including energy workers, from power in both economy and polity. So what that meant was that while democracy was in place, labor rights were in place, and that people could organize them as labor unions and oppose these their extractive employers. This was not allowed for Black workers. They could not form unions, and they could not come together. So here, Black workers did not have rights to to form a collective and unionize to demand labor rights. So Black workers could still be extracted in the same way that we've seen through colonial history and history of slavery. And this is very recent. This is not in the distant past. And this is quite important to remember, because a lot of some of the prominent works on fossil cultures and on energy democracy don't see these works. They see more works of labor unions in North America and Europe. So coal workers in the UK, perhaps also in France, who had the right to unionize and who were able to find tactics to oppose governments, etc., which were, of course, then decimated by transitions to oil and gas, and there was a whole different set of power. But within all of that schema, this history of lack of unionization or conditions of de-democratization that created lack of labor power for certain people in particular parts of the world are not discussed. And I think that's quite important for us to also then keep in mind. Especially I'm talking about prominent works on democracy and fossil fuel, like you might be familiar with the book Carbon Democracy by Timothy Mitchell, which talks about labor power in the West and its resistance to coal, etc. And a lot of my own work on caste, I will not go into that now, but a lot of my work on caste injustices, in my work, caste injustices have been key focus within energy transitions. And I've discussed how caste-based social, cultural, and economic histories mediate access to energy, access to clean energy, and benefits of energy project in Indian villages. And the question of indigeneity, I raise this especially from the Indian context, because it becomes a much more complicated and interesting question in the Indian context. So the question of indigeneity are much more complicated, and they demand a careful, long-term, grounded, and ethnographic engagement in post-colonial contexts like India. So, for example, Mabel Gargan explains that many Indian anthropologists historically have believed that indigeneity does not apply to India. The idea of indigeneity does not apply to India because the whole country was colonized. So we are all indigenous people. But in the context of India, indigeneity needs to be understood, she argues, as self-contained communities whose culture and knowledge systems are subsumed under the dominant nationalist historiography and Hindu caste hierarchies following British expulsion. So in India, within this argument that, oh, we are all indigenous, tribal and indigenous communities are oppressed. Their rights their rights over their own territories, of their own resources, are often taken away by the nation state within this idea that the whole country was colonized, so we are all indigenous. And therefore, this argument that we need to tease out the idea of indigeneity within these post-colonial contexts, I think is quite important right now, especially, well, historically has been, because a lot of extraction of coal, uranium, etc., have been within these territories, within these indigenous territories. And now in the future, also extraction of a lot of these minerals for energy transitions will also happen in these territories. So this kind of helps pry open the claims of equity and development made by the post-colonial states to show how racializing imperialistic state power both expands and fractures through the development of energy infrastructure. And finally, the question of history and difference in a shared problem like climate change also alerts us to what Moni and colleagues have explained as the influence of Western reality on the energy narratives of developing countries. By Western narrative, they mean particular imaginaries of what appropriate and adequate energy have come to mean for researchers and practitioners in global North, and how these imaginaries and meanings permeate into, often through advocacy from countries in the global North, they permeate into energy policies and discourses in the global South. So they argue that the fact that many global North countries continue emitting greenhouse gas emissions, and I don't need to remind you that UK just now decided to open up a new coal field in the coming years. So, so the fact that many global North countries continue emitting greenhouse gas emissions while indulging in the wholesale promotion of renewable energies can be a perverse approach to, and an act of what they propose as this idea of energy bullying, without consciousness of what it means to have energy sufficiency and energy mobility. So this brings questions of democracy, participation, and distributional justice together with the risk of universal Anthropocene narratives. And these have been inadequately understood and conceptualized for the global South perspective. So finally, just to conclude this long, I hope which was interesting for you, talk, what I've tried to do, that this talk has situated some of the future areas of work in critical energy social sciences within the Anthropocene debate. So I've used Dipesh Chakrabarty's two images of humans as geological force, seeking urgent unified action, and humans as fractured political force seeking further justice. And these summarize the dilemma for and in the Anthropocene. How do we engage with these disjunctive images of humans together to work for justice rooted in difference while thinking of universal human agency, I think is an important question in front of us. This is the dilemma because We need pathways for urgent action on climate mitigation and energy transitions, while centering the slow and considered work that historical and contemporary justice questions demand. At the heart of this dilemma is the framing of the human as one humanity that taps into a long history of what is human and what qualifies as humanity, emerging from the European Enlightenment thought. The work of these ideas in racializing and dehumanizing Black, brown, and indigenous bodies around the world have been widely discussed. The Anthropocene, with its universalizing tendencies and emphasis on urgency of unified action, risks enhancing these historical racializing tendencies. And so there are good reasons for us to sidestep a Eurocentric epistemology in many cases and look to other ways of thinking energy from other vantage points, many of which will enrich our ways of thinking of energy transitions and energy geographies through new critical aspects. So to think about energy transitions and energy geographies of and in a more political Anthropocene, I've tried to outline a couple of other conceptual areas and vantage points for future engagement, which I hope you found interesting. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being a generous host.
So thank you very much, Ankit, for your very stimulating and fascinating talk. And now I propose to give the floor to Nassima Abdelghafour, who is a postdoc researcher at the Centre Alexandre Coiré with Institut Francilien Recherche Innovation Société, IFRIS funding.
Hello, thank you, Ankit, for this really interesting talk. And I'll give a few comments that are mostly based on the paper you published in a Geography Compass. So I very much enjoyed reading your paper, which is a programmatic article that investigates the crucial question of how to further politicize Anthropocene. And in my understanding, it does so through an invitation to better think difference, especially difference resulting of racial oppression. So my first question is about the use of the notion of Anthropocene, because as the notion of Anthropocene has become more and more mainstream in the academia, it has also become subject to more and more scrutiny and more criticism. And so some scholars have attempted to get rid of the homogeneous, Eurocentered, male figure of the anthropos by coining other notions that I'm sure you know of. So first, there is like this idea of capitalocene that stresses the role of the early capitalists of the British Empire in accelerating climate change through industrialization and fossil fuel extraction. So we're already in a more differentiated vision of who caused climate change. So this one is an option, and another one is even, I guess, closer to the argument that you want to make, that there is Anthropocene is here as a result of racial oppression. So there's the notion of the plantationocene. So the scholars arguing that the plantation model, as you explained it in your talk, actually offers a matrix for productivist modernity based on racial oppression, landscape modification, ecological destruction, and labor alienation. And so my question is, maybe we should use this notion and gradually stop using Anthropocene to better stress this idea of difference. So what do you think about that? Maybe this notion help consider humans as political creature experiencing conflict more as a species. So this is the first small point. And then my second point would be to discuss this urgency versus justice paradox or trade-off that stands at the root of the paper. So I think it's a very interesting dilemma. So how to act fast, but with enough care for those who have been suffering the most from climate change and those who deserve climate justice. So a way to roughly understand this trade-off I think I mean, we should be more subtle, but I'll go to it that way. Is to understand urgency as a post-political, as you said, discourse that is held by powerful actors to promote unilateral action, efficient action at the expense of careful deliberation, democracy, in collaboration with smaller and disadvantaged actors who deserve climatic justice. But we could try and flip the argument. Those who most desperately need urgent climatic action, for example, I know, small islands inhabitant in the Pacific, or more recently, Pakistani people who lost their houses in floods, are precisely the ones who deserve justice. So urgency and justice also can be seen as two things going hand in hand. And in the same vein of thinking, who is really defending urgency? Because when you think of the powerful actors in the global north, they often act as forces of inertia. And they also are the forces defending business as usual and warning against the economic consequences of taking radical ecological action. So my question is, how can we locate this urgency versus justice trade-off? Does it apply beyond the realm of climatic sciences? Or the realm of media, as you showed? Is it more than a discourse? And who is actually embodying this sense of justice, and who is actually acting towards justice? And so, yeah, like, do we risk to be too naive when we repeat that there is a urgency versus justice dilemma? Maybe the dilemma doesn't exist and urgency is just a discourse. I mean, it's a very dark vision this morning, sorry. But yeah, can we think along these lines? And my third point is very much related to the previous one. It's still about urgency versus justice. So when we think of urgency, we're invited to think in terms of rhythm, of pace, of acceleration and slowing down. But what happens if we adopt a more spatial understanding of the Anthropocene, as scholars have already tried to shine a different light on the notion of urgency? So if we think with, let's say, Anna Tsing, Donna Haraway, these thinkers, sorry, we can argue that climatic ruination is not in a close future. It's not a threat. It's already there by patches in the world. And so climatic ruination in that style of thinking is already here. It's an ongoing process, and it's just affecting in an unequal manner the inhabitant of the earth. And and it's especially affecting the human groups that are directly engaging with their environment to draw their subsistence. But even more provocatively, I would say, other scholars like Michelle Murphy, for example, are arguing that ruination has always been the lot of most people on the earth, and that the acceleration of climate change is just now affecting the most privileged inhabitant of the world. So what happens if we try to think more spatially? Maybe it would enhance your argument about difference and allow to like make it very striking. And finally, I really enjoyed what you wrote in your paper about the need to be reflexive as researchers. So, and it's especially important, I think, when we want to study global problems, because global crises have to be solved in places, in sites of action. So when we think of the global atmosphere, the carbon emissions, etc., all the political propositions have to be localized in places. And so there is the need to make fragments of the world, to make places as objects of knowledge and objects of political action. And so now if we think about our role as researchers, how can we think about empirical investigation? Because of course, the paper is programmatic, and so it calls for a deeper engagement of energy geography with critical race theory. But how can we operationalize it? And I ask from a very interesting point of view, because I actually really need you to answer because it would help me in my project. So how do we go about to do field work? So you write in the paper that researchers who enjoy, by the way, the privilege of mobility, of flying places to do field work, when they produce work, when they produce monographies of local communities, quote unquote, they may be taking part in a process of rendering legible. I'm thinking of seeing like a state, subaltern communities. So in so doing, they may take part in constituting the subaltern communities as object of knowledge, object of intervention by macro actors, more powerful actors, etc. So the role of the researcher in the power dynamics, in the like climatic power dynamics, I think is a very interesting point. And I was curious about what you would advise. It resonates with other similar precautions. For example, in development anthropology, there is the work of James Ferguson saying, okay, we should stop studying Lesotho, but we should start studying the way the World Bank is framing the economy of Lesotho. So we should maybe shine the light of on what the actors from the global north, to say it fast, are doing. And more recently, there is the work of an indigenous researcher called Eve Tuck, and she's working on chemical pollution, and her and she was calling on a moratorium on what she calls damage-centered studies, because of course pollutant chemical molecules are not easy to describe for us social scientists. So social science describes polluted bodies, polluted places, and she says, okay, it's always the same. Poor people, marginalized people become the object of this science and are always depicted as deficient and needing help and needing intervention. So she was calling for stopping this type of research and inventing another type of research that would be made with and in favor of this marginalized population. So this part of your paper really like strongly resonated with all that. And my question is, okay, how do you envision fieldwork? How can we reinvent methods and methodology to actually operationalize the program of research that you are offering in the paper? So I think that's all. Thank you very much for the super stimulating propositions.
Thank you so much, Nassima. And so I will be quick because you already sketched many very stimulating and interesting perspective for the discussion, and I want also that we have time for the discussion with the room. But I wanted to add a couple of other comments and also questions. First, I found very interesting the way you repoliticize energy transition. And it is, in my opinion, a very important stake also for scholars. And it is the main reason we wanted you in this seminar. And I think that it gives also very clue in the seminar also to reframe the way we consider what Anthropocene is, but also what the solutions to the Anthropocene are, because it is something we wanted absolutely to investigate also. The solutions that are given against the Anthropocene and environmental issues are not neutral, and they need to be also studied in a critical way. And I find especially very interesting the way naming climate change or climate urgency is also a way to depoliticize the problem and also to enforce some solutions that are absolutely not neutral and that are highly political. And so thank you very much for showing that. I think also that your paper is very interesting in the way it permits us to reshape what means global, because I had at least the impression that the problem is global. Of course, global warming is global, but that all solutions were very local, at least national, because the countries are in charge to enforce some new policies in terms of energy, but also because the technical solutions are very local, like, for example, a wind farm, like a nuclear power plant, etc. And I think also the way you describe the interaction between the global north and the global south is also a great way for us also to reshape the idea of global, and that a nuclear power plant is global, that a solar panel is also global because of its production, because of the engineering behind, and also because of the waste. And if I may, I would like to make also a link with a case study that I made, that I investigated a couple of years ago in Saint-Brieuc, so in north of Brittany, with a field of windcraft, with turbines. And I think that your work is also very interesting to understand this kind of parks in a global way, because if we see what the actors are, they are exactly the same that invested a lot in nuclear energy, but also in fossil fuels before. And I think that thinking also in terms of who are the actors of this transition is very important to highlight the same patterns that are involved in the energy transition. And in my opinion, we have exactly the same patterns in energy transition based on massive production of electricity, even for renewables. Also a massive consumption, which is expected from the public and from the society. And at least we don't have a real transition in terms of consumption, but also, and I find it very interesting in your paper and your presentation, the violence behind. I mean, developing wind turbines in Brittany is absolutely not non-violent. It is a violence. It is a violence against the environment, the local environment, but also against the people there. I mean, I've observed the public debate and democratic debate for this specific project, and it was violence. I mean, we had also physical violence during some meetings. And I think, and also because the last session of the seminar was about nuclear energy, and one of the main takeaways was that nuclear energy is violent. My first question would be, are also renewable energies violent? And I have also a couple of questions, but probably a bit later also in the discussion. But one, which is for me very important, but also I'm like Nassima, I'm also very interested, for my own project. But what are also the responsibility of human and social scientists in these narratives that you describe? Because it is something we knew for a very long time. We produce ourselves narratives. And especially if we see all the literature on transition studies, at some point we may also consider that they depoliticize the problem, that they see the problem only from the global north perspective, and that at some point they also participate, because this literature in particular is very involved in policy making, and they produce a lot of advices for the politicians and for policies. Are they also responsible of what you describe? I mean, do we have, as a scholar, a responsibility in that? And the second kind of literature I wanted you to discuss is also the green on green literature that you probably know, which is based on the idea that many groups don't accept renewable projects because they don't consider the global urgency and the global crisis, and they only see the very local stakes on the environment. And that's, and I think the underpinning idea in this literature is that there are some useful sacrifices in terms of the environment. And I think it is something which would be very interesting to discuss. And last but not least, it's about your background, because we discussed it yesterday, but something very important that Ankit forgot to say is that you first started in designing and I mean, you worked for the renewable energy industry and then in trading the carbon. So how also this experience and this background influence your work and also your point of view of this problem? I think it would be very interesting to know more about it because it is probably that's something that we don't really see as a scholar from the Global North. And once again, thank you very much. And I'm sure it will spark a very interesting discussion.
You want me to respond?
Please, yes.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, this was thanks for the thought-provoking comment. It's a lot to digest, but it was so interesting, and thanks for the deep engagement with my work. I really appreciate it. I think there's a lot of questions, a lot of important questions to think through here. First, I will just say, Maël, because we were talking about this last night also about my background and that I used to work as a consultant planning renewable energy projects and also registering projects for carbon credits with the UNFCCC with their carbon credits programs. And recently I was invited in my own university to talk to some students about jobs within the climate change sector. And I made this point that I think from my perspective, the climate change sector needs three kinds of skills. One is numerical, because there's a lot of calculation of who's reducing emissions and who's not. And the other is critical, because we need to think about these things in a critical way, not least because whatever actions we take need to make a difference. So critically thinking of that, what is the change we are making, but also that a lot of this is what we're discussing just now. It needs to be critical. And the third thing I had mentioned that most of them forgot until the end was ethical. We need ethical skills. And that is a reminder from my own work as a carbon consultant that this work can be, not surprisingly, we are handling carbon. So it's very murky, it's very dirty work. And therefore, having a strong sense of ethics in that work is quite important. There's a lot of people making arguments for the argument's sake. There's a lot of money involved. And therefore, yeah, money speaks quite a lot. So I think that sense of, and that is a reminder from my own embedding in that thing. So I hope that will be something for us all to remember. But that work also kind of took me to many rural parts of India where I saw that access to energy was a very difficult thing. People did not have electricity, which is kind of, for us, is a cornerstone of modernity, right? This is what all of this discussion is about. So that's why I kind of got interested in inquiring ways of providing electricity and what that means for poorer people in their life. And that kind of brought me to social science and embedded most of my work progressively into more critical social sciences. So yeah, that's my background. I'm happy to talk to people about that also more. But to come back to Nassima's questions. Yes, so the first one about the notion of the Anthropocene. What shall we do about it? Which one do you like?
I'm a plantationist girl.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, I can get behind that. Yeah, I think out of all of this, and okay, so tell me one thing. Why do you like plantation?
Okay, sorry. This will lead me to talk a tiny bit about a project I'm just starting, but it seems that now planting trees is one solution to mitigate carbon emission. And I was very puzzled by the fact that we are using the plantation model that seems to be at the root of most of the problems we are experiencing now. So I think there is something interesting in the notion of plantationocene to think about maybe the green grabbing, about the problems that might stand behind some green solutions that are promoted nowadays as important to mitigate climate change.
That's quite useful. Thanks. I think I agree with you on that sense. And plantationocene also takes us back into the history of Anthropocene, to a place that many, I mean, at least I think, I agree with a lot of critical race scholars and indigenous scholars that that's where we need to start in some sense. But I do prefer to stick with the Anthropocene for two reasons. One is that the arrival of the idea of Anthropocene was not because of history, but because of future. So a future of common responsibility over climate change or climate actions. So that future, I think, future of unified action or making climate change common cause is quite important, I think, and therefore Anthropocene, I think, provides a useful schema for us to come together as a anthropos. But how we define that is contingent on us, and also contingent on us to push back against this universalist, male, white dominated idea of the anthropos. And I think the second point is that the history of Anthropocene, when did the formalization of Anthropocene as an epoch is still contingent, and there's a lot of arguments. Interestingly, I mean, you would already be familiar that the arguments in the geophysical union, which decides these epochs, is coming towards nuclear fallout in the 1960s as a key evidence of human change in the Earth system. But for many of us, it is the colonization of Americas that is a beginning point. I think there's important marker, scientific-based marker of fall in the Earth's temperature in the 1600s. That is evidence in the ice cores. So it kind of relates quite nicely to climate change. And therefore, even if we stick with the word Anthropocene, but we are insistent on a starting point for the word, or for the epoch, which is a much political starting point. Not just because it focuses on this dehumanization, racial injustice, but also that it decenters Europe. And that's my beef with Capitalocene, that it centers Europe, or European epistemology in a sense also. So I think that's broadly why I prefer to stick with Anthropocene, that it's also a reminder of, again, Anthropocene is a reminder of current situation of the end of the world, this looming end of the world. But it is also through those starting points that indigenous scholars and critical race scholars discuss, as a reminder that many worlds have already ended through these actions of colonization and racialization. And so I think rather than getting into finding different words, I prefer to stick with the Anthropocene, but try to politicize it as an idea, but also use the power within that idea for critical edge. I don't know if that's convincing to you. Thanks. And I think, I mean, I'm not saying this based on solely my own volition, but it is based on the reasons why some critical race scholars and indigenous scholars stick with the idea of Anthropocene rather than going into Capitalocene or Plantationocene. I can get behind Plantationocene for sure. If you see in the academy in critical social science, a lot of people are getting behind the idea of Capitalocene, and which is not surprising because that is the dominant critique in academia is the Marxist critique, and therefore Capitalocene gets a lot of purchase. Yeah, So I hope that helped clear my position. The urgency versus justice thing, who is defining urgency? I think this is quite important. I think I had not thought about it carefully. And who's defining urgency, and why am I talking about that? I think it's not just about the Guardian. It's also about the urgency of climate change, I think, has been understood. I agree with your point that there's a lot of entrenched actors who maybe personally don't think of the urgency, but publicly the urgency debate, I think, has been accepted widely. So if you ask Elon Musk, he'll say that it is an urgent problem. You all must buy Tesla, right? Or you must give me money to go to Mars and colonize Mars. Entrenched. UN, the last two UN conferences, the COP27, COP26, have been unique in the corporatization of these events. We had Jeff Bezos at COP26 stand on the stage and say that he realized the vulnerability of Earth when he went to space. What is United Nations doing in this question? And those people are behind the debate of urgency, because they are bringing out these techno-utopian solutions that we should buy, which will be premised on the same racialization and exploitation that we've seen historically. And what Maël said, that a lot of actors who are into renewable energy are the same actors who are into nuclear, who are into fossil fuel, etc. Danish company Dong Energy, one of the biggest company. It's fully, I think, solar now. Wind energy, and it used to be a fossil fuel energy company. So I think, and that's the pattern that I'm trying to sketch, that the urgency as a post-political urgency is quite there, and we can see that. I wrote a small piece recently, which should come out early next year, where I argue that if we are to say climate emergency and climate crisis, then those are inaccurate terms. What we need to use is climate justice emergency and climate justice crisis, rather than climate crisis. Because those terms are depoliticized, we need to repoliticize and introduce justice into them. Unfortunately, I've been guilty of using climate crisis also in various. I wrote a book chapter which will come out next year, fashionably titled "Love in the Time of Climate Crisis," and I'm guilty of using that. And I reflect more through my own work on climate emergency and climate crisis, that why did I use those terms and why I shouldn't. And then the question of spatiality. Yes, as a geographer, I'm totally with you for spatiality. Yeah, how to think about this? It's hard, I think. So for example, spatiality, if we think about global governance of climate change, Kyoto Protocol had a strong sense of spatiality, right? That there is a historical responsibility, and therefore climate reduction or climate mitigation work needs to be done in particular parts of the world, and climate adaptation work, which has never taken off, needs to be done in other parts of the world, or needs to be done everywhere, but prominently in parts of the world which are on front line. But that spatiality has been dissolved since Paris. And also I think we have a weaker climate accord, which doesn't has a legally binding status. It's more voluntary. It puts responsibility on everyone. Okereke argued that a cornerstone of global climate change governance has been spatial, which is the common but differential responsibilities. And he said that now we are in an era of not common but differential responsibility, but common and shifted responsibilities. So yes, I think we need to bring back spatiality. I don't have a good answer about how, but I would love to talk to you more about how to do that. our own work as social scientists. Yeah, this is, I don't know what the answer to this is, because we also work in such a complex milieu of our own institutional systems, right? That there are decisions taken by our, like I work in a university where decisions about what we teach and how we teach are often taken based on the market, the students who come and pay for those things. And then we are supposed to make an ethical and pedagogical argument once those market decisions have been made. So it's a very, in many ways, it's a violent and complicated system that we're embedded in. So yeah, I don't want to take a lot of time on, but this is something we should talk about again. What is our ethical and moral responsibilities, and how do we progress? Because we also see a lot of social scientists making arguments about changes in our work based on various politics. All work is political in any case, but politics of funding, publishing a paper which kind of worked or sort of moves them towards a particular kind of funding, whether that paper is meant for an argument of justice or not is difficult to say. So in that sense, I'm in agreement with Eva Tuck's work, and Max Libernin has also talked about this, that not only environmental pollution, but also environmental conservation is colonial. And a lot of people also talk about conservation work in parts of Africa, parts of Asia, which are basically based on territorial grab, right? Throwing human beings out of their own territories, in a sense, rather without them being a participant in decision making. So I'm in agreement with these scholars that we need to center these communities more politically and ethically within this work. There's some future work that I've been thinking about on climate justice to center some of this work, some of these communities, but how that will take place is not fully clear in my mind, but I would love to talk to you all about that when we finish, and maybe you have some good ideas. So yeah, shall I stop there, and then maybe other people have questions?